Started. Good morning, everyone, and happy recess for those of you that are working in the legislature. We are here for our summer town hall, our quarterly town halls. We have a great group of folks here today to share some updates about state legislation, the state budget, as well as the landscape for this upcoming ballot and election in November. Go ahead to the next slide, Lauren. And here's our group of folks we got today from all over the state, including the legislature and advocates and folks working on campaigns. We got a great group of folks here today, and appreciate. I'll let them all introduce themselves when they're up. Go to the next slide. And here's our agenda. As I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the budget and legislative updates, as well as the ballot landscape and any final announcements. And before we get started, I'll just share my name is Chris Martin. I'm the policy director at Housing California. Appreciate everyone for coming here today and being with us for. I think this is our fourth town hall, and so appreciate everyone that's engaged in these and helped shape them and participate in them. They've been great for us as well. So with that, I believe I am ready to turn it over to Jason Sisney over with the Assembly Budget to committee to share a little bit about the budget landscape for this year and moving forward. Over to you, Jason.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Sisney, and I'm the budget advisor to Speaker Rivas and Assembly Democrats. Good to be with you today. I'm going to talk about the big picture of the budget that was passed a few weeks ago, and Jeremy Morelos, who covers housing for the Assembly Budget Committee, will follow up and talk in more detail about the housing components of the budget. As most of you know, we had a challenging budget year. And while the economy of California continues to grow and to, in fact, grow pretty well, really, we've been dealing with the last couple of years in budget with the sort of fallout, the hangover, if you will, from the COVID pandemic. The COVID response by the federal government really spiked the economy in 2021 and 2022. That resulted in huge, probably unprecedented increases in both federal and state tax receipts, income tax receipts in particular. And in 21 and 22, the state had large surpluses, as you will recall. And we knew at the time that those revenues would not last. We made efforts to budget pretty cautiously, but it turns out that the drop off in revenues after that spike was greater than we anticipated in 2022. And so the last couple of years, we've been dealing with the ramifications of that. In 2022, the state, as you may recall, budgeted tens of billions of dollars toward principally one-time purposes, including housing programs, a lot of infrastructure costs. There were some program expansions in 21 and 22, including expansions of the Medi-Cal program that have long-term ongoing costs. The state also sent out billions of tax refunds. And while the state did fill up its rainy day fund to the constitutional maximum of 10% of revenues, the fact that we have a constitutional appropriations limit originally set in 1979 prevented the state from setting aside a large portion of those surpluses in reserves. As revenues have trailed off a little bit the last couple of years, we really wish we had set aside more in reserves. That would have been very helpful. But the reserves that we have been able to set aside have been very useful in helping to bridge the gap in the budget this year. This year, with the deficit that was identified by the governor and the LAO over the spring, there were a few different priorities that we heard from our members in the assembly. And I think that they were pretty similar to what my counterpart in the Senate heard from senators. The first was that the members had a very strong consensus to want to preserve our core social services programs such as CalWorks, IHSS, SSI, SSP, and similar programs, and Medi-Cal for that matter. Members wanted to preserve those programs that benefit low-income Californians. That was a very consistent thread across all parts of our caucus. And another thing relevant for this group in particular is that given the significance of the housing crisis in every community in California, they wanted to preserve as much of our housing investments as was possible. It wasn't possible, we knew from the very beginning, to preserve all of them. And so we had conversations with the members. Some of them happened in subcommittees publicly, looking at the most important and most effective housing investments that we had. And as Genevieve will talk about, the members asked the leadership and staff to prioritize preserving those investments. And I think that going throughout the process, plainly, those were the two priorities: social services and preserving housing, along with preserving classroom funding through Prop 98. And that really was the watchword all through the spring. Once we got to the May revision, the governor put out a proposal that basically tried to balance both this year's budget and next year's budget, which is a good, prudent idea, something that's never happened before when California had a deficit. And in so doing, the governor set a target to only use about half of our rainy day fund over that 2-year period, this year and next year. And the legislative leadership agreed with those goals. And then we worked with the governor to try to come to a consensus, which we did in the middle of June to try to achieve that. With that, I'll ask to put up the slides. I have a few slides that look at some of the big picture of the budget. And this slide shows the projected deficits in the general fund by fiscal year from last November, when the LAO put out their original forecast, to the governor's budget in January, where he balanced the 24 budget, but left a deficit for later years. And then on the bottom line, the June Budget Act, where the governor and the legislature agreed to balance this year and next year's budget, but leave a deficit for later years, albeit much reduced from the original deficit forecasted earlier. So this is the situation where we are now. And I show this slide to really emphasize that what we did in this year's budget was very helpful to stabilize the budget situation. As I mentioned, we had overcommitted state resources in the prior 2 years. And this year's budget helps stabilize that situation, brings the long-term deficit down while balancing this year's and next year's budget. But there is a deficit still remaining. I think the key lesson that I would offer here is that I do not foresee that there will be a lot of opportunities to have significant new investments in the budget over the next few years. That's because we're still going to be dealing with a long-term deficit. And as I'll mention in a moment, we have some things that we need to pay off, if you will, temporary solutions that we use to balance the budget this year. Go to the next slide. One of those things is Prop 98. Here, I've put across the deficit bars a red line that shows the Prop 98 school funding maintenance factor balance as of the June 2024 budget. And so one of the things that we did to help balance the budget is that we kept school funding growing, but we were not able to provide in this year's budget as much school funding as Prop 98 would have expected for the 2022 and 2023 fiscal years. That's looking back in time, but the way that the formulas work, we did not have enough money on hand to budget all of those funds right now. And as a result, the legislature voted to suspend Prop 98 for the 23-24 fiscal year. That creates a maintenance factor balance. That's sort of akin to a loan. It's not really that, but you can think of it that way. And it means that school funding is entitled under the Constitution effectively to get the most of any additional dollars that come in revenues above our forecast until that maintenance factor is paid off. And at the end of 25-26, we'll have $4 to $5 billion of maintenance factor. At the end of 24-25, we'll have $4 to $5 billion of maintenance factor still to pay off. And so if we get more revenues in 24-25, almost all of those additional revenues will go to schools until that obligation is paid off. And so that is one of the reasons, in addition to those deficits, that I don't think there will be a lot of room for new additional investments in the budget over the next few years. Let's go to the next slide. Another reason that I think we're going to have challenges in finding new funding for stuff in the next few years is that we are using half of the rainy day fund balance to balance this year and next year's budget. That we have about a $210 billion general fund budget in the state right now. And as indicated, prior to this year, we had sort of grown to the constitutional maximum, about 10% of revenues. And we're going to take that down to around $10 to $11 billion over the next couple of years. To the extent that there are more revenues, once school funding obligations are paid off, there will be a lot of need to build that rainy day fund and our other reserves back up to prepare ourselves for the next inevitable downturn. And in addition to these obligations, the state also did other borrowings internally. We have a temporary funding mechanism by suspending corporate tax credits and certain corporate deductions that we effectively will have to pay off beginning in 3 years. And there are other one-time maneuvers that are part of the budget as well. So you can take the slides down. I think that I was intending with those slides really to make that point, that over the next few years, I do not see a lot of opportunities for big new investments while the state, continues to stabilize the budget situation after the last couple of years of challenges. I think for our members, they're very interested in making sure that the spending that we do have in train, the commitments we have made in various areas of the budget, our members want to make sure that funding is being spent well. I think there is a perception that a lot of the recent investments that have been made have not been spent well. And we have a lot of demand from our members to spend a lot of time making sure the money we do spend goes out effectively. And so one of the bits of advice I would give, not only to you all, but advocates in other sectors as well, is really focus on holding on to the dollars that you already have. It's going to be tough to get additional dollars, and focus on ways that we can spend the dollars we already have programmed more effectively. I think that there's going to be an audience for that the next few years. We have a hearing in our budget committee schedule for August 6th, where our members are going to talk about their oversight and accountability priorities for 2025. And that's really to give staff like Genevieve the opportunity this fall to work with members in preparing for those hearings, of where we want to dig into the programs that we already have and think about how they can work better. With that, I'm happy to take any questions before handing it over to Genevieve to talk in more detail.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, if folks have questions for Jason, please throw them in the Q&A so we can make sure to hit on those. And just as Jason mentioned, we're going to have Genevieve talk specifically about the housing and homelessness investments that you'll see. So we will jump into that. I do see a question in there about LIHTC, which I do anticipate Genevieve will talk about. So any specific questions for Jason about the overall budget picture before we jump over to the housing side of things?
And I'll hang out till after Genevieve talks, so I can chip into any Q&A there. So turn it over to Genevieve.
Good morning, Genevieve Morales with the Assembly Budget Committee. And I'm here to talk about both the housing and the homelessness investments that we did this year in the budget. And really to lay the foundation, I think as Jason said earlier, the members had a high priority on housing and homelessness. And as we entered the year, we knew a number of things, starting with housing, we knew a number of things that were happening for housing dollars. One, we knew that the bond fundings were depleted and that there wasn't additional dollars available for the bonds. We knew that there was both two discussions on bonds working through the legislature. There was a housing bond discussion, and there was also the Prop 1 bond discussion going in January. We knew that the governor's budget did a number of cuts on the investments that we had done when we had the surplus for housing funding. And so we knew those dollars were in jeopardy. And then finally, we knew that the governor hadn't reinstated the additional $500 million for the low-income housing tax credit. So that was the landscape that we entered January in. And working from there, our members told us, housing is our priority. Can you look at our housing investments through the lens of what programs over time have produced the most units and which ones have put the most units up the fastest? And so through our work through both Subcommittee 5 on state administration, which is general government, and also through our work in our new subcommittee hearing 7 on accountability, we worked at really digging into those questions and getting answers. And I think a number of things have emerged, and they were basically that we knew that we needed to invest more dollars in the low-income housing tax credit. We needed to continue to have that pipeline of resources available. We also knew that we also needed the multifamily housing program dollars to help complement the dollars from the low-income housing tax credit. And then we had one other really important element that I think really helped move some of the priorities for housing investments forward, and that was just the work from the advocates. And because our members heard from advocates, they heard we protect low-income housing tax credit, protect multifamily housing program, and also protect the regional early action program, the REAP 2.0 dollars, because those dollars had already been moving and they were likely to get more units up the quickest. And so that's kind of how our housing agenda got shaped this year. We knew that we couldn't, as Jason said, we knew that we were likely to have cuts in the programs, and we knew that over the past few years we had invested in some new innovative programs that were barely getting started even like 3 years after their initial funding. And we knew that they, in a time where we had surplus dollars, they could work, but our members really wanted to make sure that we had something that was tried and tested and would be able to get our dollars moving the quickest and get units out on the ground. So that's kind of how our housing program emerged, and we ended up adding additional $500 million in the low-income housing tax credit. We restored $315 million for the multifamily housing program, and we also restored $260 million of the $300 million for the REAP program. Our members were, in addition to that, we also restored ongoing funding for the housing navigation and maintenance program, which helps foster youth. One of the big discussions and priorities for our members as well. So that kind of was our housing budget. We believe that we have, enough money in there to help kind of fill gap years. But again, future years we are going to have a lot of challenges in the housing world, and I think that our members will still continue to have housing as a priority, but it's going to get a lot more difficult because this year we had money kind of in that housing space, and next year there really isn't any of those dollars available and kind of free, and we'll really be dependent on future member priorities as well as future revenues in the budget. And then for the homelessness funding, again, we had homelessness as a priority, but our members really said one thing, and they said that they wanted more accountability on the homelessness dollars. So a lot of the work that we did, again, through Sub 7, I think we use Sub 7 a lot in the new Committee on Accountability, and I think that we'll continue to see that committee used for this oversight and accountability. But it really helped us dig in on the homelessness funding, where we looked at, what additional accountability metrics can we put on it on the homelessness funding. In particular, the HAP funding is where we started out, and some of the things that we did is we again reemphasized that the funding was to supplement, not supplant, local homelessness funding. We provided language in there to say that there is urgency in members using these dollars. And using these dollars, we created we expanded the Housing Accountability Unit over to HCD to now also encompass the homelessness programs that we have. So these would be HAP, encampment resolution grants, as well as the I think the family challenge grants kind of fall under this umbrella, but we have a new unit to really help locals with technical assistance, but also keep an eye on what is actually going in every local jurisdiction's plan. And we want to make sure that they're executing those plans and also getting assistance if they need help in executing those plans. Um, we also put these new spend down requirements where you can't, for round 6, you can't access the additional funding unless you've met, the second, you have a compliant housing element and you've spent down your other half of the previous round of dollars. And also we have, if you don't, if a jurisdiction doesn't have a housing element compliant, or they're not housing element compliant, sorry, then at the end of the day, they could lose their dollars if their dollars are held for them until they become housing element compliant, but there's an end date. So if they're not housing element compliant before the end date, then they definitely won't have the opportunity to spend their dollars down for that round 6. So we really wanted to make sure that there was an urgency, that local governments were spending down these dollars, they weren't sitting on these dollars, and so that we could address the homelessness issues as much as possible. And then finally, for the first time ever, we did get reporting and metrics requirements on the encampment resolutions fundings, because we added additional dollars for encampment resolution grants. And I think that was one of the biggest things that we heard in sub 7 was that all of these dollars need to have accountability, and in particular that encampment resolution funding. So that's kind of like our big investments that we had. We were able to add that extra billion in for round 6. We were able to add additional dollars for encampment resolution funding, and we restored a lot of housing funding. And I am happy to answer any questions about those dollars as we move forward.
Great. Thanks, Genevieve, for that overview. Just a reminder for folks, please throw questions in the Q&A portion for Genevieve and Jason. We kind of have 2 questions in the chat or in the Q&A that I think one probably for each of you. And so curious, Genevieve, the question is how the state auditor's report around accountability may play into funding, in the future for both housing or homelessness.
It definitely played a big role in for homelessness this year. I think that report came out right, like maybe a couple of days right before we were having our sub 7 hearing on accountability for the HAP program. And so everybody it really focused members. Hey, there's not enough accountability on this program. We are going back and people are asking us, how are you using these dollars? And then it really helped kind of get accountability on the encampment resolutions grant program. And so I think what we were trying to do, I think what we lacked over the years is that, this program was housed over at ICH, but I think now that it's moved over to HCD, it really has a lot of nexus to the other programs that are out there that locals use for their dollars. And so HCD can say, wait a second, we know you still have money from this program or this program that you can also use for housing. And they also know that whether or not a jurisdiction is compliant with their housing element.
Great. There's a quick question as to what is sub 7. If you want to just mention that real quick, since that's a newer subcommittee.
I'll mention that the speaker in taking office last summer created a 7th budget subcommittee, sub 7, he split up subcommittees 1 and 2 that handle health and social services, but also created a new subcommittee focused on oversight and accountability. And so that subcommittee has a pretty far-ranging brief. It really can go wherever the members want to go. And as Genevieve mentioned, we did have a big hearing this spring that was hearings that looked at housing and homelessness programs and their accountability matrix. And one of its hearings did sort of coincide with the auditor's report. It is pretty difficult to talk about accountability in the homelessness space because each round of the HAP program is kind of independent of the others. And while they do have some interrelations, to some extent, a lot of the commentary that happened this spring was about accountability rules for HAP rounds that have been in the past that haven't exactly reached their deadlines for getting out the door and submitting data. But nevertheless, the demand from members and the public is quite strong for new metrics and new rules in that space.
There is a question specific to Joe Cerna and agriculture worker housing. I don't know if Genevieve, you want to hit on that real quick.
Yeah, we didn't direct any dollars specifically to the CERNA program. We put them in the the multifamily housing program. And there was a question about the Supernova as well. And the Supernova kind of releases all of these programs at the same time, the IIG, the MHP, and the CERNA program. But we didn't put additional dollars into, the IIG or the CERNA. So it really is the multifamily housing program there. But additionally, there are dollars that are dedicated, I believe, in the low income housing tax credit to CERNA from a previous bill that I can't pull up off the top of my head. But I know that there is some dollars that are available for CERNA or set aside through the low income housing tax credit on there.
Perfect. And then maybe for Jason or Genevieve that want to take this last one about whether there's been any conversation in the legislature on increasing revenues through either a new tax or some type of way of pulling back tax breaks, those kind of things. Has there been any conversation about that?
Well, one of the things that I would offer is that this year, one of the proposals that was in the governor's May revision was a 3-year suspension of large corporations' ability to use their tax credits and their net operating loss deductions. It became apparent in our legislative deliberations with the Senate that the only way to achieve our objectives, to preserve housing programs, keep classroom funding strong, and preserve social services and housing programs, the only way to do that was to start that 3-year suspension in 2024. The governor was not necessarily a huge fan of that idea. And basically, as you'll see in the difference between the legislative budget at the end of May and the final budget, the governor pushed the legislature essentially to pay back those suspensions of credits. That really shows that the governor does not appear very eager to agree to increases in tax revenues, to pulling back tax expenditures, as you were mentioning. And so we've seen that this year. And so that's something that's very important to remember. We definitely have members who are interested, I think, in both houses at looking at some of those tax increase options on an ongoing basis. I don't think there are a majority of the members, certainly in the Assembly, but there are some. On the other hand, we also have members of the Democratic caucus who are very resistant to looking at tax increases and concerned that that would hurt companies that are directly affected by them, and concerned also that it would increase the cost of living. And so I think that is a candid view of the situation. There definitely are members who are interested in it, who have introduced bills for changing corporate tax expenditures, who have looked at raising taxes on a broader basis. But I do think that the governor does not really seem to be that interested in that conversation. And that is the reality of where we are. And I don't think that's necessarily going to change during the remainder of his term. And so that's one of the reasons why I think, everybody should be looking ahead with a pretty cautious budget outlook. In California, over the last couple of decades, one of the only ways that there have been significant ongoing tax increases, be it on high income individuals or companies, has come through the ballot box. And I think that that is another thing that advocates who want those changes may need to consider.
Well, thank you for that. I think with that, I know we have a lot of questions in the chat, and what we can do is try and answer a lot of those in the Q&A box so that we can move to the next piece here and talk about legislative work. But want to appreciate Genevieve and Jason. I know hopefully you're catching your breath after the long and intense budget year, and appreciate you both joining us and all the work you guys do. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. With that, I'm going to move us over to the legislative portion of this, and I believe Anya is going to be leading us through that, and I'll just ask each speaker when you start to introduce yourself, and so everyone knows who you are and where you're coming from. But over to you, Anya.
Great. Hi, everybody. Anya Lawler with Public Interest Advocates. We are a lobbying and consulting firm up in Sacramento that represents a range of mission-driven entities, including a number of legal services organizations and the California Coalition for Community Investment, which is a coalition of CDFIs that do work in California. So I'm here to lead us through a discussion of what is going on in the legislature this year in the affordable housing space, accompanied by three excellent panelists. So where we are right now in the legislative session is, I think, much to the joy of those of us who work in the Capitol, we are on summer recess. The legislature finished the policy committee work in the second house on July 3rd, and then immediately went on recess, which gives everybody a chance to take a little break and regroup. And then they will reconvene in early August, where we will go through the appropriations committees in the second house, and then on to the floor to see which bills survive. I would say, just sort of picking up on some of what Jason Sisney was just saying, while we do continue to see substantial numbers of housing related bills, I think, and I'm curious if my fellow panelists agree with this, I think we're seeing fewer sort of big impactful bills in the housing space, and perhaps fewer bills that are going to be deeply substantive in terms of increasing the supply of deed restricted affordable homes. There's a lot of very worthy bills running that are sort of making additional tweaks to local zoning and permitting approval processes and impact fees. And I don't want to say that those things aren't important, but it's hard to look at the bill list this year and see a single bill that is like the thing that is going to be a game changer on affordable housing. And definitely seeing the legislature focus perhaps more on trying to lower the cost of market rate housing, and maybe less specifically on expanding the supply of deed restricted affordable housing. And part of that, of course, is tied up in the state's budget challenges. There is not currently enough money to go around. And as Jason said, not a broad appetite in the legislature among members to actually create new robust funding sources. And I think that's been a source of frustration for probably all of us on this panel who, worked hard to try to get additional funding in the budget to pass a housing bond, knowing that at the end of the day, the most critical thing we need right now if we want to expand affordable housing opportunities in California is money. So that's a little bit disheartening. But, as Jason said, there are some members who do want to focus on that. And another trend we've seen emerging is that there are quite a few members who were running bills over the last couple of years to try to create various rental assistance programs, recognizing that most people with low incomes do live in market rate housing, and obviously cannot afford that rent. And I think we all are skeptical that the feds are going to step up in a big way to drastically increase the availability of vouchers nationwide or in California. And so really starting to think about how the state can play a role there. Obviously, there's no money for that, but it is interesting to see a number of members running bills in that space. So that's kind of the general overview of where things are at. There's a couple of specific bills that I'll mention, but before we do that, I want to kick it over to Alex, Justine, and Graciela to see if you have anything to add to that general overview. Justine, you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Anya. My name's Justine. I work with Enterprise Community Partners. We're a national affordable housing organization, and I'm based in our Northern California office. I think your assessment of where things are at resonates with me. I'm excited about kind of the flow of today's discussion because we will be getting to some of the items on the ballot, which I think there's a lot of excitement there, and there was a lot of work done in the legislature this year to get us to where we're going to be on the ballot in November. So that's one thing that I would kind of highlight. And then I do think that some of what I want to talk about today is maybe some of the topics that we've been starting conversations on this year, in particular insurance, that I think will kind of ramp up in the next legislative year. Alex or Graciela, what else you'd add at a high level?
Yeah, thanks, Justine. Thanks, Anya. Hey, everybody. My name is Alex Visotsky. I'm with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. We're a DC-based organization that focuses on lifting up what works to end homelessness. And I do California work for us. I'm based in Los Angeles. Um, I think that framing from Anya is exactly right when it comes to homelessness as well. Probably the most impactful thing we can do to address homelessness in California is pass a permanent, ongoing funding program to fund local jurisdictions' responses and local jurisdictions' efforts to rehouse people experiencing homelessness. But in this budget deficit, that was not on the table this year, and we had to fight just to kind of keep the funding that we had, which Genevieve talked about, the HAP6 program. I think what we're seeing, and I think maybe we'll get to this in a little bit, what we're seeing a lot more is kind of this tinkering around the edges and really kind of looking at some of the best practices, and I think sometimes in unfortunate ways trying to roll back some of the best practices that have become kind of focuses and scapegoats for why homelessness is not being solved in California. That includes Housing First. And there's a lot of work, I think, to try to protect Housing First in state law this year. And then we've also seen a number of legislators looking at criminalization, and had to do a lot of work over this past legislative session to ensure that we did not see kind of statewide criminalization, which I think in light of the Supreme Court decision from a couple weeks ago, we'll expect to see more conversation around that in the coming months and in next year as well. So looking forward to talking about that more.
Yeah, no, thank you. And just to add kind of a bit of a finer point on this, unfortunately, with the budget deficits that we're going to be facing, this will have implications for the type of policy that is pursued statewide for the next coming year, not just for 2024, but 25 and 26. Because at the end of the day, if there's any additional cost associated with the bill, that is not going to fare well as it moves through the process. So a couple of things. I know that everybody on this call was pretty aware that we were doing a lot of work to try to pass a housing bond, AB 1657. Unfortunately, that did not come to fruition. So we're kind of wondering, how do we actually continue that conversation, understanding that we're not going to have as robust investment from the general fund as we have in previous years. So the question is, what can we do to continue to ensure that we have funding as we continue to deal with some of the budget deficit? So that is going to be, I think, a big theme coming up. Going back to what Anya was talking about, because of the lack of additional state funds, the legislature has been working on pro-production bills that really are focusing on market rate as a way of trying to figure out, can you actually loosen up some regulations on that end to try to lead to additional production? I think that over the last couple of years, many of you have seen legislation that has done that, like AB 2011, SB 9, 423, all of these ministerial approval bills. But there's starting to be some frustration in the legislature because they are not resulting in the promise, like thousands of units that everybody was anticipating. So there's growing frustration with members, and I think there's going to be a call for additional studies or accountability to figure out, we are passing a lot of legislation, but we're not actually seeing the level of or the number of units that we would like to see. We're not seeing people getting off of our streets. So what else can we do? I think everyone's starting to appreciate now that on one hand, yes, you can loosen regulations, you can do other things, but when the interest rates are as high as they are, when the financing is not penciling, there's another piece that is missing that we might not in the state be able to alone figure out. So more to come on that.
Graciela, do you want to quickly mention who you are?
I am so sorry. Yeah,
okay.
Thank you. Hi, Graciela Castillo-Crings. I am part of Sacramento Advocates, and I'm a lobbyist in Sacramento, and I have the pleasure of representing a few of the clients. One of them is Enterprise Community Partners, the California Housing Consortium, just to name a few.
Great. So thanks everyone for those thoughts. I think we're going to talk a little bit about some bills of interest that continue to move. I will kick it off with a preservation related bill and then want Justine to pipe up on other preservation related issues. So AB 2926 by Assembly Member Ash Kalra is a bill that is making some changes to the state's preservation notice law, which is a kind of in the weeds, wonky law that those of you in the development field may be aware of. It requires a series of notices and imposes other requirements at the point where a deed restricted affordable housing property is ending its affordability term. For the last 8 or so years, there has been a requirement in that law that when a property is kind of ending its affordability term, the property owner give a first right to preservation-oriented purchasers who would buy the property and restore the affordability, give them the first right to make an offer. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, the property owner doesn't actually have to accept any of those offers. It could simply keep the property and convert it to market rate, which is unfortunate if there's a preservation buyer willing. So what AB 2926 would do is require a property owner to accept a preservation offer if one comes forward, or re-deed restrict the property themselves. So we are not seeing a lot of preservation offers, and one of the reasons that we have heard from mission-driven entities is because they don't want to spend the time, which is understandable, putting together an offer if there's no requirement that the property owner take it. So hopefully that stimulates more preservation offers, not solving the entire preservation problem, but hopefully a step in the right direction. And Justine, I know you've been working on some bills in the preservation space, and if you could mention what's happening there, and then also perhaps take the opportunity to dive into the insurance issues.
Sure. Well, we certainly are supportive of the preservation notice law bill. So glad you mentioned that. Another important bill this year related to preservation is AB 1789, the Quirk-Silva bill, which would expand the scope of the portfolio reinvestment program. That's the existing state program for preservation of existing affordable housing that is reaching a point where you could lose its affordability. This would expand the program beyond projects that are currently HCD funded to just kind of reasonably challenged at-risk projects across the state. This is really the outgrowth of a lot of work that preservation practitioners and a number of our colleagues, particularly California Housing Partnership, have done over the last few months. The challenge with this bill, and it relates to maybe the broader theme around preservation that I wanted to lift up, is that the portfolio reinvestment program right now is currently out of funds, right? So we're talking about expanding the scope of what is a really important program, but at a time where the existing funds that were appropriated to that program have all been used for needed projects, and there was not any additional dollars allocated to the program this year. This budget cycle, as folks have discussed, we were able to hang on to funding in a number of really core programs, which is huge. We know that funding for these production programs like MHP and the state tax credit that Genevieve mentioned are critical. We've done some research this year showing there are, over 46,000 new production units in the pipeline that need funding. And preservation is the other side of that coin, that right now there is a real lack of state funding allocated towards. Unfortunately, in this year's budget, funding for the foreclosure intervention and housing preservation program was completely eliminated. That was a preservation program focused on smaller buildings, up to 25 unit buildings that are at risk of or facing foreclosure. And the other kind of important funding program that we've been working on for a couple of years, the Community Anti-Displacement and Preservation Program, or CAP, which was SB 225. The funding for that, the vehicle would have been a statewide housing bond, which, as Graciela mentioned, didn't move forward this year. So I think that while we've made good progress over the last few years, elevating the need for preservation, kind of the timing coinciding with these budget challenges has been a really tough blow to the preservation space, which is just, it's newer work, right? It's a little bit less tried and true in terms of having that track record. So we know that that's something we're really going to need to focus on in the coming years to help make the case and ensure that we get additional dollars for that work in the coming years. I'll just say briefly on insurance. This has been a year of really starting big conversations around insurance. I don't need to tell anyone on this call that insurance is an issue because I can see all the names on the participant list. It's a major challenge, both cost, access. We know it's hitting folks across the state, rural, urban, especially our PSH providers. The big things happening right now from the state perspective is this major regulatory reform that the insurance commissioner is leading. And that is going to address some of the issues, but certainly not all that affordable housing providers have been facing. So we've been focused this year on laying the groundwork. A couple folks on the line participated in a legislative briefing we did around the insurance challenges specifically for affordable housing providers. We've been doing outreach meetings with members. There's a new Senate task force that just got set up, and I think we're really setting the stage for some more serious legislation that we're looking forward to working on with many of you next year. So I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Justine. Alex, can I kick it over to you to talk about maybe one, no more than two, critical bills in the homelessness space? And then I'm going to kick it to you, Graciela.
Yeah, sure. I guess the main piece I would talk about is around Housing First, which for those that don't know, we hear a lot of talk about what Housing First is from folks that don't always know what they're talking about. But it's for those that don't know, it's a federally recognized best practice that was enshrined also in state law through SB 1380 back in 2016. And it's basically a set of principles that says the best way to end someone's homelessness is to remove any preconditions to getting them back into housing. So obstacles like requiring sobriety or having service participation as a precondition, all of those things that can make somebody, fall down on their journey back into housing. Housing First says yes to services, yes to listening to someone as to what their goals might be, including goals for recovery, sobriety, but that those things shouldn't prevent someone from accessing a housing program. There's a lot more nuance to it, but that's kind of like my bird's eye view of it. And just a reminder that when it comes to like data on homelessness, this is kind of the gold standard here. The data has shown us time and time again that Housing First is the most effective approach to getting folks back into housing and keeping them in housing. So there were a couple bills that sought to amend state Housing First law. AB 2479 from Assemblymember Haney, which was sponsored by the Bay Area Council, and AB 2893 from Assemblymember Ward, and which was sponsored by a group called SHARE that sought to kind of create a clearer pathway to allow state homelessness programs to fund housing programs that require sobriety, programs like recovery housing. The bills have kind of now merged into one bill, into AB 2893, and a lot of work from groups like Housing California, like Chris at Housing California and Sharon Rapport over at CSH to ensure there are kind of proper guardrails in those bills. So AB 2893 now says that local jurisdictions receiving state homelessness funding can use up to 10% of that funding on a county by county basis to fund, sober living programs that otherwise can be challenging logistically to fund through a Housing First approach. But there are a number of guardrails built in, guardrails including ensuring someone actually has choice, ensuring that they aren't being forced into sober housing because there's nothing else out there, limiting the ability to evict somebody because they've had a relapse, right? Relapse is a natural part of recovery process for a lot of folks and shouldn't lead to somebody being homeless. So AB 2893, which is kind of enshrining that, is now in Senate Appropriations, and we will see if it makes it through. A number of other bills that sought to undermine Housing First, for example, SB 1438, which would have weakened some of the eviction protections in Housing First, that died in Senate Housing. And a big shout out to Chair Skinner and her team for really kind of keeping that conversation on Housing First focused on what works. And then I'll also mention quickly, because I think we're going to see more of it coming down the pike. There was a big struggle around criminalization this year. We had a bill, SB 1011, authored by Senator Jones from the San Diego suburbs, which would have kind of created a statewide encampment ban. That fortunately was killed in Senate Public Safety. And big shout out to Chair Wahab there and her team for, again, keeping the conversation focused on what we know works to end homelessness, right, which is housing and services. But I expect that we're going to see more of these conversations in light of the Supreme Court ruling at the end of June. And so it's going to be incumbent on all of us to continue, who work with folks experiencing homelessness, who build affordable housing, who build PSH, that are service providers, to continue lifting up what we know, right? Which is that it's the housing that ends homelessness. It's the services that end homelessness. It's not, moving people around. It's not undermining housing first approaches. So I'll kick it back to you, Anya.
Thanks so much for that, Alex. Graciela, are there any particular production related bills that you want to lift up?
I think just two to put on folks' radars, which I think probably already are, but just to make sure. The first one is AB 1893 by Assemblywoman Wicks. That is actually kind of trying to modernize the builder's remedy. And the reason I bring that up is that bill is sponsored by the Attorney General's office. They're trying to basically create more clarity around the process of builder's remedy. We really haven't seen it used as often, simply because a lot of the housing elements have not actually been there hasn't been a lot of accountability. That has changed in the last couple of years. And so trying to put some parameters as to how that process is going to work out and how it's going to be used. The reason that is becoming really important, again, as there have been additional pieces of legislation that is taking away local control, there is starting to be a bit more of a backlash. You're starting to see people wanting to run things on the ballot to say, we're going to remove the power from Sacramento to actually tell us what to do. And so one of the things that Assemblywoman Wicks has been talking about is making sure that if somebody is going to use a builder's remedy as a way of getting a project moving forward, that there are parameters as to the amount of density. She's really concerned that suddenly there might be, a huge building in a single family home, and that actually would embolden folks and remove the legislative authority that they currently have. So that conversation is going. If you're interested in that discussion, please get involved. One of the concerns around the bill is that it also changes the level of affordability that a builder's remedy project would have. And again, the question is, how do you, the discussion in the legislature when it comes to the pro-production bills has been, what is the right level of affordability to ensure that the project moves forward to balance both? And again, I'm not going to say if there's a right approach or wrong approach. That is up to each individual organization to decide how they want to engage in that discussion, but that is a conversation happening right now. So I'm raising that issue. And then the other one would be AB 2243, which is an expansion on AB 2011, which is really trying to kind of use commercial and residential, commercial and office space buildings, things like that, to make it easier to build housing. So those are the two. I know in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there, but happy to answer any questions.
Thanks for that, Graciela. And just to build on what Graciela was saying on 1893, I think just even on this call, there are organizations with a range of positions on that bill. It is probably the highest profile housing bill, I think it's fair to say, running in the legislature this year. A lot of engagement, a lot of support, a lot of opposition, and it'll be interesting to see how all that plays out as the bill continues to move forward. The author did commit to some amendments when the bill was up in the Senate Housing Committee on July 3rd.
And Senate Local Government.
Senate Local Government, thank you. It was only 2 weeks ago, but it feels
like
months ago. So more work to go. A lot of interesting conversations packed up in that bill. And I know we're running out of time, so I just want to mention one bill in the tenant space There are actually not a lot of bills in the landlord-tenant space this year, but one bill that frankly sort of unexpectedly continues to move forward with little opposition is a bill related to evictions. For those of you that work with low-income tenants, you may be aware that evictions in California are in very, very expedited timelines. Right now, if a tenant gets a summons in an eviction proceeding and an unlawful detainer, they have just 5 days to file a response, which is really challenging. Because most low-income tenants struggle to find access to an attorney. Most legal services programs do not have capacity to file a response in 5 days on behalf of every single tenant that gets one. And so even tenants who have very legitimate defenses to that eviction often end up losing purely because they don't file the answer on time. AB 2347 by Assemblymember Ash Kalra, who chairs the Assembly Judiciary Committee, would double the time to respond from 5 days to 10. Which would be a huge improvement for tenants who are really just trying to figure out how, like, what is it that's at stake? What are they being accused of, and what defenses might they have? Perhaps they have none, but they may have very legitimate defenses, and having that extra time would be huge. And so that that bill continues to move forward. The only organization still opposed is the California Association of Realtors, and hopefully that bill makes it to the finish line. Chris, I think we ended on time. I think there are probably still questions that we haven't had a chance to get to. I don't know if there are any, Chris, that you want us to specifically answer right now.
There's a couple clarifying ones. There's one question. I think the question is what AB 2011 was, because I think somebody mentioned AB 2011, and then what the eviction bill you just mentioned was, Anya. 23.
The bill I just mentioned was AB 2347 by Assemblymember Kalra, and then Graciela, do you want to? I can cover 2011, or you can.
Go ahead, Anya.
Sure. AB 2011 was a bill that was passed 2 years ago at this point.
Yeah, 2022.
2 years ago by Assemblymember Wicks that made housing a use by right in most commercial zones, either 100% affordable housing or mixed income housing that includes, I want to say 15% lower income units, but don't quote me on that inclusionary percentage because there's so many streamlining tools and they all have different percentages. So Wix has a bill this year that is sort of dealing with some implementation issues that have come up on that, and is also expanding its use to a broader geography.
Anya, the last question that might be helpful for you to answer is really whether and how people should still be engaging as we're like nearing the end of the legislative season.
Yeah, and I welcome others' input on this, but one of the dirty secrets of the legislature is an enormous amount of the work on bills ends up happening in the last month of session sometimes, especially on the higher profile bills. And so especially on bills where there's still support and opposition and active negotiations going on, there is definitely still plenty of time to continue to engage and weigh in on bills that are sailing through and don't have any opposition. Authors are typically still interested, even if it's a bill that you missed and you suddenly are reading it now and you're going, oh shoot, that actually really impacts my project or it impacts my business or whatever. Authors are generally still willing to have that conversation. So I think it's never too late to show up at the table. My advice, though, would certainly be that if you particularly have a concern with a bill, that you reach out rather than just sending a letter with a position, because it's really hard for members to address your concerns if they don't know what they are. I don't know if other folks have things to add to that.
And just to add to that, I mean, remember a lot of the bills coming out of the last policy committee, which happened July 3rd, were amended. And so many of us are still reviewing some of the changes that happened to those bills. So it is still timely to have a conversation with staff, with members. I mean, this is part of the process. And to Anya's point, staff is expecting additional conversations to continue to happen. So don't be shy about talking to members, reaching out to your legislator, reaching out to district staff and Capitol staff. It's still, the legislative process is still going until August, the end of August. Conversations can still happen.
Alrighty, well, I think with that, we'll move to our next section. Want to appreciate Alex, Graciela, Justine, Anya for joining us today and all your work in collaboration with us. And appreciate you all for being here. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to Housing California's Executive Director, Shioni.
Good morning. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to our guests. It's wonderful to be with you all this morning. I apologize in advance. I was not expecting my neighbors to have a jackhammer going today. So if it gets a little noisy, I'll try and wrap up my comments. One other reminder before I get started is that we will be sending out the recording from this session afterwards. So if you've registered, if you're on here today and you missed a bill number, missed something that our speakers at the top shared about the budget, you'll have a minute to learn about that later. We're going to transition now and actually kind of go back to some of the themes that we were exploring at the beginning of this call. We're going to move into a conversation about the ballot. This year's ballot conversations have been full of issues that impact us as housing advocates. And we have three great speakers who are going to talk both about a really exciting initiative that Housing California is super proud to be a part of, as well as two very, very important local initiatives, all focused on trying to figure out how we solve for the lack of funding to support affordable housing. So that's been a theme throughout this conversation, that we're making some good progress on the policy side, but where we're really stuck is on funding. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Before we jump in, I want to provide a little bit of context because the questions have come up in advance of this call. Many of you have been tracking or hearing us talk about a proposal that was originally intended to be on the ballot, the California Business Roundtable's proposal that would have required all new revenue measures, new taxes, et cetera, to be subject to a 2/3 voter requirement, something that for us was a huge concern for our long-term success. Totally flies in the face both of our values around having a strong functioning democracy and presents a whole host of challenges for those of us working to bring new money to the table to solve our housing and homelessness crisis. So we were very excited and pleased that in late June, the California Supreme Court determined that that initiative is not consistent with our Constitution and should not move forward. So that's been pulled from the ballot. Nevertheless, we know that there were many people who were supporting that, who are deeply invested in its success, who have a lot of money to bring to the table in an electoral context. So that's still all in the air. That resistance orientation to the work that we're doing is in the air and is part of the fight that we're up against as we think about our November ballot. There are some other initiatives, one in particular, Prop 47, which is an effort to roll back some of the advances that California had made in changing how people were penalized for crimes and affected our criminal legal system. So there's an effort to scale back some of those wins and to roll back some of that. And I will say that effort is both about the substantive issues of how we should punish people who have done things wrong, but it's also about turning out a particular kind of voter, and a particular kind of voter who has historically not supported public financing of things like housing. So those two factors are part of the backdrop that we're working against. That's kind of the challenges that we're up against. I think the real exciting part of our backdrop is that we know voters are with us. Throughout the last 6 months, a number of us have, through our campaign work, through the conversations we were having on the bond, through conversations about the climate and school bond that will also be on the ballot, lots of polling was happening of California voters. And what that polling found over and over is that housing is the number one issue that Californians care about. Housing and homelessness is where the public wants us to be putting our attention. It's where they want to see solutions. So we're really positioned in a place to take advantage of that public support. And we hope that the 3 campaigns we're talking about today can actually lean into that, can activate those folks, and can help us make some progress that will be transformative for our communities. So I'm going to start by turning over to Sandra Lowe, who's working with us on the Yes on 5 campaign. She'll share a little bit about the campaign, the impacts that it will have on our communities, and as well as some of the ways that folks can get involved, bring support from their localities, et cetera. So I'll pass it to you, Sandra.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, and thank you for giving Prop 5 the big entree here, because this is really going to be transformative for the entire state of California. Just a little bit of background about me and the work that I've done. I was political director for the California Teachers Association for over 20 years. And during the time I was there, we were able to change the threshold for passing school bonds from 66 2/3 to 55%. So I tell everyone, apparently this is my life's work, to make sure that the infrastructure, schools, and housing that we need in California can be attained at the local level through reasonable policies. And basically that's what Prop 5 is. It lowers the threshold for passing housing and infrastructure bonds. It started out, we were going to go down a pathway of signature gathering, and we were delighted when Majority Leader Cecilia Aguiar Curry, on her 5th attempt to get this through the legislature, got a little wind in her sails, and we were able to work with her and and ACA 1 at the time to get it through, and then ACA 10, which clarified the focus of it to be bonds, and now we're on the ballot as Prop 5. So we can go to the next slide. I'm piloting these slides for you. First time, so give me feedback in the chat or send me an email. So just some facts. If you go and look at the supermajority and what it has done over the last decade and further on, you can see that absolutely what would have been a landslide vote in any other election are failure votes. 66% is a failure vote. In any other election, that would be considered a landslide. And this is a fire district bond that you can see in Santa Cruz. When the city of Berkeley, clearly a place where we have a lot of progressive pro-housing voters, cannot get a housing bond through, you know that somewhere in the Central Valley or Orange County, they're going to have even a harder time. And these are, the list can go on and on. I live in Sonoma County, and so I see Santa Rosa, a place that has strong support for housing, unable to get past this threshold. And we're really happy that the author expanded this to be more than housing, because in some places you're going to need the roads, the transit, the water, the utilities, the broadband to make these homes a reality. In a lot of places, those infrastructure in cities and so forth, doing infill, those may be in place. But in places in rural areas where we need to also invest, these are very difficult. And fire is, I want to put at the top of the list, and why the California professional firefighters are strong supporters, were indeed sponsors of this legislation. Because remember, when you call 911, it's not just for a fire, it's also for health. It's also because you are having a health emergency or a car emergency, and having the infrastructure at those firehouses with the ability to get out to you in case of any kind of emergency is absolutely paramount to everyone in California. So we're very proud to be partners with the California professional firefighters in working on this measure. Next slide, thanks. So a big deal for voters, as you can imagine, is that they want to make sure that everyone is accountable. We're not in the greatest atmosphere. I think we can all agree with that. You know, if you turn on your TV, you can see that there's a lot of political concern out there, all the way from the top of the ticket down to the local level. And so putting in very strong accountability measures was critical to this, to making sure that we have a strong proposition. So the projects have to be clearly listed. Strict conflict of interest checks. Citizen Oversight Committee, which is also a huge part of the school bond program and has been very successful. And independent performance audits, et cetera. And I bring this up because, you know, you might say that's a given, but when you go out to your communities and you talk about Prop 5, please mention this. This is important to the voters. They really are concerned about how their money is being spent. And we know that things are so expensive nowadays. And so every dollar that they spend on a bond is something that they're not going to be able to spend on something else. And we have to make sure that we tell them to the dime how it is being spent. Next. So we had strong legislative support, as you see, that was for ACA 1 and ACA 10. That's how it all came together. Our coalition is growing, and every day I'm on the phone or I'm on a Zoom call. Today it's just been nonstop, talking to organizations to ask them to please join our team. We were really excited last week when the League of Cities voted to endorse the measure. This because obviously cities will be among the top of the list in terms of putting these bonds forward. And, you know, true confession, in my hobby, I am a city council member in my small city. And I can tell you right now, we are gonna look very closely at putting forward a housing bond so that we can provide some of the housing needs for the small community that I live in. We're getting individuals will go before the California Democratic Party later this evening. The California Labor Federation is voting today. And so if you're in an organization, please reach out to me and let's make sure that we put your name on the list. We've got a strong campaign. Most of us have been down this road before. We're very experienced in terms of ballot measure campaigns. We know how to diminish the opposition and strengthen our base. We've got a lot of energy, and with the good people in this room, virtually and otherwise, I know we can win. So moving on. Of course, we need your help. My email is at the bottom, and everybody asks, what does that stand for? Marshall is just my middle name. Nothing tricky about it. It's S as Sandra Marshall at gmail.com. Please send me an email. Please let us know who we can speak to, where we can do this presentation, whether it's a local club or, you know, just a core group of people. And of course, we are also, of course, welcoming any contributions to the campaign. So I see a note from Shoni that questions will be answered in the chat, and I'm happy to answer them. But you can also shoot me an email anytime, day or night, and I will respond and get you your answer. So I'll leave it there because I know we have a full agenda and some other great measures. Thanks so much for having me here.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Again, if you're interested in joining, contributing to the campaign, monetarily or with staff capacity or in some other way, please reach out to Sandra and she'll help plug you into the right place. We're going to transition. So one of the, you know, Sandra talked about an initiative that's really around like freeing up local money. We have two campaigns today who are like leaning in to that mission, recognizing that our state is not funding the level that we need. We have Tommy Newman, who's going to go up next, talking about how LA advocates are coming together to actually raise revenue in their region to support new affordable housing development, homeless services and supports, and all the things our communities really need related to housing. So, Tommy, I'm going to pass it to you and let you share a bit about the work y'all are leading.
Well, it's great to be here, and thank you, Shani. I have about 90 minutes for this presentation. Is that correct? No, I'll talk fast. So, really appreciate being here and being with all of you all today. I'm really excited to share the work that's happening in LA these days, which is a lot of good work and some good recent homeless count results as well, driven in large part by the Triple H funded supportive housing. 4,000 units of those opened last year, and it's a key piece of why homelessness was able to decrease in LA County for the first time in a really long time. So a reminder that when we make these investments, they pay off. We can jump to the next slide here. What I'm sharing today is a mix of both work that's been happening and the campaign work that we're discussing. So in LA County, we know that on the one hand, we've been tremendously successful at helping people end their homelessness and come indoors. On the other hand, we have not invested enough in homelessness prevention or in the preservation and creation of affordable housing. So here are just a few examples. We also know that we need to be looking at every solution. And so in the context of this campaign, we'll be talking a lot about increasing access to mental health beds. And what Brilliant Corners found was that there were nearly 6,400 underutilized, so they could be brought online with a higher reimbursement rate, mental health beds in LA County. And so how are we thinking about this whole continuum of needs holistically, critically important? And so these are some of the insights that inform what we're about to talk about a little bit more. We can jump to the next slide. La Casa, as one piece of the puzzle, is very similar to the Bay Area Housing Finance Agency, also known as BAFA. And it has the ability to do all three of the P's, affordable housing production, preservation, and renter protections and support. It has some of the DNA of community redevelopment agencies from once upon a time, which, were both helpful and not in various ways. So we tried to pull the good pieces forward. One of the things that we've gotten a lot of traction on, and we think is an incredibly important part of La Casa, is the support for small cities. So many of the cities, there's 88 cities in Los Angeles County, and so much of the focus is often on the city of Los Angeles and a handful of others. But so many of these small to mid-sized cities are looking for more support, just as we heard Sandra talk about in terms of making resources more available. They're looking for more support. And so a key piece of this puzzle is technical assistance funding for cities to help them update housing policies, to help them create new ways to prevent homelessness from happening. The La Casa board, which was the picture we saw on that first slide, has small cities well represented, and the enthusiasm has been really high. So I do think that there are a lot of small cities out there looking for more resources, more support, and more help as they feel the pressure from some of these pieces of legislation that has been passed in Sacramento. So these are some of the things that La Casa can do. And the question is, how do we fund it? How do we spark this at a countywide scale, increasing resources across LA County? And that's the ballot measure that the Our Future LA County Coalition has been working on for quite some time. We can jump to the next slide. So, a citizens initiative for LA County, a long time in the making. So a year ago, the Our Future LA County Coalition convened a really robust working group process. We met twice a week for 12 weeks. Started out by establishing the facts. What are some of the needs? What are the needs for the ongoing homeless services in Los Angeles County? What are the needs for production, preservation, and protection? How do we think about the balancing of these needs? We investigated different revenue sources, ranging from documentary transfer tax to a parcel tax to a sales tax, all of them needing to generate sufficient revenues, at least $1 billion a year, and trying to get closer to $1.2 billion a year annually for LA County. So that was a long and hard process. Building consensus in LA County is not easy. Building consensus amongst advocates, cities, the county, other stakeholders really hard, but everybody's really focused, eye on the prize. And so we were able to build that consensus. We were able to file the citizens initiative back in the fall. And then we had to do the next really hard part, something that's never been done in the history of LA County, which is circulate a revenue measure and secure sufficient signatures to get it on the November ballot. And so as you can imagine, LA County's big, and we needed to collect hundreds of thousands of signatures. Our Future LA County Coalition stepped up, collected tens of thousands of these signatures. Of course, we also had paid folks that we worked with. This was a multi-million-dollar effort. It took almost 6 months from beginning to end to collect the signatures, but we got them. We submitted them in early May. About 4 weeks later, the county affirmed that we had enough signatures. And so now we begin the campaign to November. And we feel a little bit behind because we had to spend the last 6 months collecting the signatures and raising the money to get it on the ballot. And now we got to put our foot on the gas for the push to November. But it's a good problem to have, and the coalition is incredibly motivated. We can jump to the next slide. So just unpacking a little bit more of what this measure is and how we'll be communicating it to voters over the coming weeks and months. We'll be leaning into these three frames: more housing that we can afford, increasing access to mental health care, and more accountability. We've heard the accountability frame pop up multiple times through the call today. You will notice that we're not sort of speaking to homeless services generically, but we're instead being more specific. That's something that's really come back to us through polling and focus groups, is specificity is our friend here in this campaign. And so we're going to need to be more clear. You saw on that first slide there, the Brilliant Corners report finding 6,400 residential care facilities beds could be brought online. So that's an example of how are we more specific? How do we offer solutions? When LA County jail is the largest mental health facility in the United States, we know we have a problem. And so how are we creating alternate resources and new resources? This measure will help us do that. We can jump to the next slide. There's also a lot at stake. There are nearly 30,000 people who are receiving housing or services right now, funded by the previously approved voter initiative, Measure H, back in 2017. This measure will repeal Measure H early and replace it with this new approach. That's going to be a core component of the campaign as well. And we're certainly not going to be disrespecting or denigrating any of the work that's been done. We're going to celebrate the fact that there are 30,000 people who are either in interim housing or who are receiving services right now in permanent supportive housing, or in rapid rehousing, right? Like, these are all folks who are receiving these services right now, and it's critical that that continues. If it were to not continue, if their measure were to expire, which Measure H will expire in the future, that could drive a nearly 25% increase in homelessness. So we're going to talk about both the work that's been done, the lessons that have been learned, and what we need to do differently going forward. That's going to be sort of the arc of the campaign here in LA County. Jump to the next slide. So what's it going to do? Next slide. This is just a breakdown of how the measure's funding shakes out. And so you can see it really is critically maintaining and stabilizing funding for the homeless services system in LA County. That's critically important. It has a much more significant local return for these small cities that want to do more and want to get in the game. That did not exist in the previous measure. And then you can see the really meaningful down payment on scaling up a countywide approach to production, preservation, and rental protections and support. La Casa, this would represent $1.2 billion total is the total pie here. And then you can start to slice it up based on these numbers. La Casa's funding has a minimum guarantee. The homeless services funding does not. And so one of the things that we'll be working hard is continuing to make progress, bringing folks in indoors, reducing unsheltered homelessness. And in future years, we'll advocate, I hope, I predict, to shift dollars from homeless services into La Casa, affordable housing production preservation. So it's flexible between these different slices of the pie here so that we can adjust over time. Next slide. Some key pieces here. I know I'm running out of time, so this sort of speaks to itself, but these are some of the ways that we'll be talking about this. You'll notice that make housing more affordable is a really consistent frame that we'll be using. I'd invite everybody to use this frame up and down the state because it really resonates deeply with a wide range of folks who are all feeling the squeeze on homelessness. And then we know prevention has been dramatically underfunded, and we need to scale that up. Next slide. And jump this one. These are 5. When we talk about accountability, some folks are like, oh, what does accountability mean? And how does that show up in the ballot measure? These are 5 mandated goals that are written into the ballot measure. And we're really excited about these. The numbers are going to be fleshed out by a new oversight body that was created by the LA County Board of Supervisors and by the La Casa Board, depending on which one of the metrics. And I would point to number 5. We have never had a homelessness prevention goal in the history of Los Angeles County. And we're just incredibly excited for this measure to help spark that goal and create a focus on prevention that we've literally never had and struggle to track the data on. I know we're just about time, so we can jump. The funding source is a sales tax increase. It's a 1/4 cent in LA County increase. And just note to self, a lot of folks don't realize what is exempt from sales tax. And so we'll be telling that story as well. It won't be the leading message, but we'll try to help folks understand that some of the core basic needs are not impacted by the sales tax. This is one of the reasons why we have incredibly broad support, more than 100 organizations supporting. We can jump to the next slide, which I think is that one, and that can be my last slide. If you're interested in being a part of this, if you're in LA County and you're not already a part of it, feel free to reach out to us. I'll drop the link into the chat for the campaign website. You can also track us down at United Way or anybody that you see on here. We're building this machine and we're March and November and really appreciate the support and the time on this call. Thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you, Tommy. Our last wonderful speaker is Heather Hood, joining us from Enterprise. And Heather has really been our champion, our trailblazer in helping to create the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority here in the Bay Area, and is now part of the campaign to really resource that work going forward. Heather, I'm going to pass it to you and let you share a bit about BAFA, where the campaign's at, kind of how people plug in, anything you think might be useful for our guests to hear.
You got it. And I respect that we have little time, so I will be brief. This effort has started 6 years ago, and it's taken a village. Folks like NPH, All Home, and the San Francisco Foundation have been the core group working with the Regional Housing Agency. Now, here we are. The Regional Housing Agency we helped start has voted unanimously to put the $20 billion Bay Area all 9 county bond on the 2024 November ballot. So this is an incredible opportunity for grassroots coalition building, racial and economic equity, and community leadership. So just real quick, we've got a shortfall of, like the rest of the state, of more than 220,000 homes here, and nearly half of our renters are spending way more than 30% of their income on housing. So it ain't right. We are looking at a pipeline here in the Bay Area. We know of mostly entitled projects. There are 35-ish thousand homes that are ready to go to be built. That's with almost 400 developments. So for the production side of this, we know exactly where the projects would go. The way that our bond was structured in the parameters set by AB 1437 or 1487 was that about half of these funds, if we were successful, would go for production. 15% would be for preservation. There's just a little under 5% for protection, and that's a quirky thing about bonds, unfortunately. But then the rest of the 28% would be for a variety of basically what you could call innovation projects. So that could be all kinds of things. So we're in go time. We just got through that kind of feasibility stage and are now in ramping up with a crackerjack team of campaign consultants, pollsters, media folks here in the Bay Area. We have a lot of fundraising to do. Oh my God. Woo! To really get this to sing in the next month. So we're in camping ramp up mode, and then we'll be rolling out like Tommy said, here in the Bay Area, it's going to be just like in LA. It's going to be pedal to the metal. So with the coalition that's been built here and until the Pro 5, so or the Yes on 5 group. So I don't know. I'm tired thinking about it, but it's go time. 4 months to go. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Heather. We have a couple questions about bond numbers, ballot numbers. Some of this has not been set yet for the local initiatives, but that will be coming. The folks on the call today
are 4.
You're 4. Yep, we lost Heather. So maybe we're 4. Justine might know the answer to that.
Yes, we are regional measure 4 for the BAFA $20 billion bond.
Tommy, is there a number yet for the LA regional initiative?
Likely going to be A. Yes on A.
Likely yes on A. So you have 3 great points of contact: Heather Hood or somebody from Enterprise to ask questions or plug in to the Bay Area campaign, Tommy or the team at United Way. There are many others, of course, but a good starting point to plug in to the Bay Area, the Los Angeles County Initiative, and Sandra to help you plug into Yes on 5. I just want to take a minute to thank you all again for joining us today. If you have feedback, if there are things you would like to hear us talk about on future town halls, please reach out to our team and let us know. This is really a space that we try and hold for you all so you can connect to some of the work happening in other parts of California at the state level. So we really do want to hear your feedback, and most of all, big appreciation for joining us today. You will get a follow-up with recording, slides, etc. So thank you for joining. Have a wonderful afternoon.